Hi, I'm Marty West, Executive Editor of EducationNext, and I'm here today with Brian Gill of Mathematica Policy Research and the author of a new article on charter schools in the spring issue of EducationNext. Brian and his co-authors studied charter high schools in Florida and Chicago and found that they're graduating their students between 7 and 15 percentage points higher rates than similar students at traditional public schools. Brian, where does this study fit into the larger literature on charter schools? What makes it unique?
Well, as you know, Marty, and as I'm sure many of your readers know, there have been a lot of studies about achievement in charter schools, looking at test scores. Most of them have focused on elementary and middle grades, typically because they're relying on state assessments that are only continuous up through 8th grade. So high schools have been relatively neglected, and thus far, nobody prior to this has looked at attainment outcomes, graduation and entry into college associated with charter school attendance. We did a quasi-experimental analysis that controls for the usual demographic characteristics for students' prior test scores to account for differences. But I think more importantly, what we also did was that we limited our study sample to kids who were in charter schools in 8th grade.
Okay.
That is, both the treatment group, the kids who attended charter high schools, and the comparison group, who attended conventional public high schools, all of them were in charter schools in 8th grade. And so we think that that is a pretty compelling way to control for the self-selection that's involved in attending a charter school. All of the kids had attended a charter school at some point in the past. And in fact, particularly in Chicago, in many instances, the distinction between the treatment kids and the control kids, that is the determination of whether they went on to a charter high school or not, appeared to be primarily related to the grade configuration of their existing charter middle school. That is, kids who were in a charter school in 8th grade where that same charter school continues up into the high school grades typically stayed there and therefore went to a charter high school, whereas the kids whose charter schools ended in 8th grade didn't. Sure. And so I think you can make a pretty plausible argument that when the kids were choosing their charter school as of, say, 5th grade or even kindergarten, that whether that charter school included high school grades was probably not the primary consideration. And so I think it's a reasonably compelling quasi-experimental design under the circumstances.
Sure. So do we know what it is about these charter schools that's leading to success in promoting educational attainment? I know that some of the charters that I visited in the Boston area, for example, really organized the school culture around going on to higher education with college pennants in every classroom, the like. Is that what's going on here? Or?
That's one of the things we don't know from this study. Interestingly, these findings are consistent with some of the findings from existing research on Catholic schools, which, as in this study, some of those studies suggest that there is a stronger effect on students' attainment than there is on their test scores. And people have speculated that could be the result of a variety of features of the organization of those schools, one of which is a focus on getting kids to graduate and to go on to higher education. Another is the size of the school and the intimacy of the environment and the possibility of greater social support for continuing in school. And it wouldn't be surprising, and in fact, given what we know, again, from other qualitative studies of high-performing charter schools, if they were producing some of those kinds of effects. Another possibility, again, that might be the case in Chicago, although appears not to be driving the Florida results, is that the grade configuration itself could have something to do with this.
What do you mean by that?
Well, as I mentioned, in a lot of the kids, especially in Chicago, a lot of these kids who are in the study sample because they were in charter schools as of 8th grade didn't have to switch to go to a charter high school. They were in charter schools are in Chicago and in many other places are much more likely to have unconventional grade configurations that span a wider range of grades than a standard elementary, middle, high school configuration that you'd see in a conventional district. And so they're much more often to have configurations that are, say, 6 to 12 or 7 to 12 or even K to 12, and eliminate the transition between middle school and high school.
So if the change itself is disruptive, then eliminating that disruption can be one of the reasons possibly.
That's entirely possible. Again, we can only speculate on that at this point because we can't really tease it out. In Florida, it doesn't appear to be driving the results. We see some similar results regardless of grade configuration. In Chicago, most of the kids in our sample are in schools that have these configurations, so we can't really distinguish them. But there is, as you know, of course, there's lots of evidence that that ninth grade is a really difficult year for lots of kids, and that middle school, high school transition produces for many kids a disruption that where they end up on a path to dropping out. So this may be a case where conventional public schools could learn something
very concrete,
schools.
very
Right.
specific, and easy to adapt. And that's obviously one of the things that it's hoped that the charter school movement will provide, is some lessons like that.
Yeah, and in fact, of course, there are various urban districts now doing this kind of thing and exploring some of these longer grade configurations, either with K-8 models or 6 to 12 models. So it'll be interesting to see how those work out.
Great. Well, it sounds like you've given researchers and readers a lot to think about, and thanks for taking the time to talk with us today. The unknown world of charter high schools is in the spring issue of Education Next.